Hello, and welcome to our next discussion in the Guidehouse webinar series, Pathways to Resilience Infrastructure 4.0. My name is Christine Richards, and I'm excited to be your host for today's call. So today we're going to talk about building back better, increasing the resilience of city infrastructure and services. So we've really seen over the past several months, city priorities have changed dramatically, and many of those changes are going to have long-term consequences. So we're going to take some time today to talk about the impact on cities of COVID as well as climate change, talk about what does it really mean to reshape our future in terms of resilience to those threats as well as others. And then talk about how communities and organizations are beginning to address these challenges and even opportunities that are coming out of the changes that we've been experiencing. But before we do that, I just want to give you a quick background about Guidehouse's energy sustainability and infrastructure segment, just in case you're not familiar with us. So at Guidehouse ES&I, we're a team of about 700 people, a lot of experts across a lot of different areas, and we really focus on helping organizations and communities build more sustainable, resilient communities and infrastructure. And one piece of that is Guidehouse Insights, which you may know as formerly Navigant Research. They're definitely a part of our team as well. So if you're looking to get more information about some of the topics that we cover here today, we definitely encourage you to check out Guidehouse Insights or connect with us on social media. You can see our handles there, and we'd love to connect with you. And so we brought a few of our experts from the Guidehouse ES&I segment here with us today to talk a little bit more about the topics at hand. So we're going to take a moment just to introduce each of them and learn a little bit more about them. So first up, we have Britt Harder from Boston, and Britt is really focused on supporting sustainability and decarbonization for corporate as well as our government clients. Now, Britt, just as a way of introduction, I saw, as I was looking into your background and history that, you were originally trained as a research scientist, and one of your first jobs is a field biology investigator. So I wanted to learn a little bit more about how you grew into, the work that you're doing today from that beginning.
Oh my goodness. I mean, at its core, it's always been about taking data for social good. I was a biologist. I was studying the impacts of climate change on seabirds and the impacts of endangered species in West Africa. And so I was doing that, and ultimately I wanted to, have a bigger platform, be able to influence organizations and work with them rather than writing papers that I felt like only a small number of people read. But it's always been sort of the same thing at my heart, which is I wanted to work really hard and really rigorously and make the world into the thing that I think we all believe it can be.
Excellent. And I mean, what are you seeing in sustainability today around communities? I mean, what's the biggest thing out there that you're really paying attention to?
I think the biggest thing we're seeing in sustainability is, I would say really twofold. One, it's more than just climate change. It's now it's environment and social and economic vibrancy intertwined. And so we're really seeing that realization come, and we're seeing a big tipping point. Technologies have gotten cheaper, investors have gotten interested. That I think there's been sort of talk of a moment where sustainability was truly going to become mainstream, and I think we may actually be seeing it now, and I think that's very exciting.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely be getting into that technology piece here today. All right. Thanks, Britt. All right. Next up is Mackie McCleary, who's out of Boston as well. And Mackie, you really focus in on energy and infrastructure within cities. And I feel like I have a theme here as I'm introducing people and looking at your backgrounds. Mackie, you really started in architecture and have evolved into energy. So what's the connection there, and how did you make that jump?
It's interesting. So, like, the really simple answer is I actually did my thesis on energy and waste in New York City. So, if you think about architecture, architecture is actually much more than buildings. It is the design of the world. And especially for cities, you're talking about all the pipes, all the things that hold everything up. And I got really interested in that in 2003. Ended up starting a renewable energy company after school. in 2003, a little bit early to that party, but kind of my love affair with energy and infrastructure began, in graduate school. My career as it progressed, sort of one of the things that became clear is that when I really wanted to be in a position to be in the room where these critical decisions were being made that influence the way cities and cultures are shaped. I worked on the World Trade Center project when I was in architecture school, and I was not in those rooms at that point in my career. And I think the career, as sort of winding as it's been, I spent a lot of time in management consulting. I spent a lot of time running agencies for governors up here in New England, and now back in consulting. I think being able to be influential and to help drive the thinking and action as it comes to the way cities and cultures evolve with respect to technology, infrastructure, and energy is that's kind of how I got here.
Nice, nice. Yeah, and I have a background in horticulture and landscape architecture, so I feel like we followed a similar path. All right, and last but not least, we have Eric Woods, who's a research director for our Smart Cities and Urban Innovation area within Guidehouse Insights. So, Eric, I don't know if this is picking on you a little bit, but you have a background in English literature. So, how did you make that leap into smart cities? What was the key change there?
Yeah, well, that was back in the Neolithic period, but I actually did my PhD on, it was actually an examination of writings on late 19th century and early 20th century cities and the development, including looking at the work of Charles Booth, who did this massive study of London labor and life, which was probably the first attempt to put the study of poverty on a scientific basis. So, some of those themes were there then. And then a career swerve through IT and local government, and then a couple of decades as an industry analyst. And here I am, still writing about cities. So there's been a continuity there.
Nice. And what excites you most about where cities are heading in terms of technology?
Yeah, I think the most exciting thing for me now is that many of the most valuable things we've been talking about regarding smart cities over the last decade, about really driving value out of technology and aligning it with the really critical issues cities face. That is really now become core to the way cities think about their strategy. And some of the things we're going to think about, I think, are really going to reinforce that message. We're really starting to try and understand how technology can best be used to meet those necessary city outcomes.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. And I know you're not able to join us via video today. You had some technology issues, speaking of technology, but we're excited to have everyone here and look forward to a great conversation. Now, in order to help tee up some of our conversations today, we just wanted to get a sense of what you all are thinking about, how your world is looking today as well as into the future. So we're going to do that through a few polls here, just to get a sense of what's going on with you all out there, and hopefully help drive some of the conversations that we have. So I'm going to bring up the polling box here, the polling slide, and I'll give some instructions after I read the question. All right. All right, so we have some people that were already responding to it, which is great. So if you're working from home during COVID, how often do you feel restricted by bandwidth? So take a moment. You'll see that Matthew Spady, our trusted webinar producer, pasted the link into the chat box, so you can follow that, and we'll see what comes up.
My answer is obviously sometimes.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, how might you answer this question, Eric? All right, so let's see. We'll give people just a moment. It looks like we're getting, sometimes people are experiencing bandwidth issues or feeling restricted by bandwidth. What are some reactions to that? Mackie, how about you?
So, I mean, I think it's not surprising if you add up sometimes and very often, you're up in the 60, 70% range.
Mhm.
Um, it's essentially the critical piece of infrastructure for our age, even prior to the pandemic. And with the pandemic, the amount of pressure on that throughput has increased. It's one of the things that honestly, I've been, uh, you hear a lot of people talk about smart cities, and I've actually sat in very awkward pitch meetings with the mayor or the governor and, my team, where a company will come in and spend an hour talking to us about how amazing smart cities, and the mayor will be like, great, I would like to buy that.
Mm.
You can't buy it. It's not a thing to buy. There's nothing to purchase. The one thing that is consistent across all imagined smart city outcomes is a ubiquitous, reliable, and probably zero latency network bandwidth, right? A lot of
Mhm.
bandwidth everywhere. That is the one thing we need, both for machines and for people, but in the smart city world, more for machines. And so, not surprising to see this. I think, if folks are like me, I think within the first 2 to 3 weeks of the pandemic, I had purchased a mesh network for the house so that we could run the 4 or 5 Zoom conferences that were going on at the same time with my kids' school and my work. But even with that, it's still hard. And so I think it's a it's the way I would describe it. This is a crisis that we should take advantage of from a policy point of view.
I think the other thing to add to that is I think it's probably fair to assume this is a pretty privileged demographic in terms of connectivity, and we're still having problems. And I'm sure we'll come back to this, but one of the things the whole crisis has highlighted is the critical importance of access, and also, how unevenly that is distributed in our communities, and what it means, in the modern world to not have that. And I'm sure we'll come back to that. It's becoming a critical issue when we start looking at where cities go from it.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a great point around, the people who are participating in this webinar. So that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's do the next question here. And this one is looking a little bit further ahead. So we talked a little bit about the immediacy. And the next question we have for you all is 5 years post-COVID, do you think cities will be denser or less dense? All right. And so we had options of denser, less dense, or about the same. So we'll give this just a moment. And Britt, it'd be great to hear from you as we're kind of pondering this, of what your reaction is to
I think
what
I
we're
see a few
seeing.
things. The first is, I think we don't know. I mean, these numbers say we don't know, and I think that's true. I mean, we're still in the pandemic, and so we don't yet know how it's going to shake out, and we are still sort of watching the migration of work. And I think we're still sort of living off of our legacy connections to each other and our legacy approaches to work and to finding work. And so, I mean, that's really what drove a lot of that density and clustering in the first place, was that access to opportunity, both professional, and to a lesser degree social. And so I think we're going to see whether we can truly live this way, this sort of the dispersed work from home vision or not, because that vision's been kicking around since the 80s and has never really come true, because we've always seen that being together provided us, these benefits of innovation and connectivity, and overlaid with this sort of good but not great broadband. I think it remains to be seen, but I think that's very interesting, and it'll depend a lot also on how the pandemic ends. And do we feel like we're in a world where this particular challenge is going to be constant, or either because of federal response, biomedical response, or general awareness, we think that this particular issue may not reoccur and we can return to a dense form. So
Yeah, definitely. How long is it really going to last? Because I mean, cities, they definitely are changing constantly, but I mean, building infrastructure, building homes and all those sorts of things can definitely take time.
I mean, one thing to add to that, though, is that, to be clear, we've been having global pandemics for a million years, and we still have cities, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes our nature is to sort of overreact and think everything's going to change, but in reality, this movie has happened before. I think another way to talk about this, Brett, and I'd be curious your thoughts on this, is okay. I'm not sure what we mean by post-COVID, first of all. I'm not totally sure that exists. We don't know, right? We don't know what that means. But if there isn't one, how will cities and how will smart cities help cities react? If there is no such thing as post-COVID, like how will our investments in technology and policy potentially make dense living livable, doable, enjoyable again?
Hmm. So I think that, I mean, I like the things that you're talking about around, that we keep coming back to this form, and that I don't think there's any reason to believe cities are going away. In terms of what that future is that we need to plan for, I think that's actually, as we talk about sort of, who's doing a great job, what are cities doing, we're all surviving right now. Cities are surviving, and they're now surviving thinking about school. And before they were surviving thinking about emergency rooms. But that, I think the concept of how can we know a future, plan for a future, what we're seeing is resilience, flexibility, the need to build approaches that can be, tried and can also be able to be flexible. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in, both, sort of small scale mobility, as well as the technology itself, being able to communicate with each other, telehealth, voting, all of that stuff is coming up. And so we're seeing cities experiment with ways that we can continue without necessarily having to be in the same place all the time. But I think that's different from assuming that we will go to a world where we are never in the same place as each other. And
Yeah.
I think similarly with energy, similarly with a number of other sensing technologies, like that technologies will help and empower us to be able to withstand these shocks and to sort of be resilient to whatever may come, whether it's climate, whether it's pandemics, et cetera.
Yeah. Eric, do you have anything to add around maybe, I know you're in London and more the global perspective. I mean, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just reinforces as well that we're going to see a huge variation across cities as well. I mean, it's one of the characteristics. The cities are unique. They're each formed out of a different history and geographic position. And we've seen that already in terms of difference of responses, and then they learn from each other. And there's a big difference about the impact that's happening on, say, downtown New York or central London, where it's been huge temporarily because they're so dependent on tourism, retail, office space, long commutes and so on, but are also the cities that are most likely to go back to something that look the same as a global center than others. Whereas smaller cities and towns are probably carrying on more or less the same in many ways while still dealing with the pandemic. So there's a lot of variation in what we see. But I agree with the guys. I think that there are very strong historical and economic drivers for why cities are the way they are. That at the moment, I think we will expect that to sort of pull back to that pattern. But I think we could have very dramatic changes around smart parcels of that operational model for cities, and that's where things like the remote working, how we'll commute, and I think one of the ideas really getting strong attention that I'm very interested in is this notion of the 15-minute city, which has been promoted in places like Paris and Portland, which is rethinking some of the hub elements of big cities, where you can get the access to services without needing to get into a car, without having a long commute. And that's been driven both by quality of life requirements, but also by sustainability needs. And I think it fits very well, and we're seeing that in the doubling down some cities like Paris are making on this, that it fits very well with some of perhaps the new requirements in this post-pandemic environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Britt, did you have something you want to add, or?
Oh, I was just going to say, I thought that the concept of the 15-minute city and sort of relating to the concept of resilience as being more that, there is certainly a physicality aspect to resilience, but there's a social aspect. I remember Chicago's resilience plan. I think they talked about spreading the services through the city. Some people talk about making sure there are toppings on all the parts of the pizza, if you want to, get a little bit silly about it. But the idea that you don't have neighborhoods that don't have everything they need in them, which are traditionally marginalized communities, underinvested areas, lacking transit, lacking services. So thinking about the opportunities to support equity as we move to resilience as well.
Yeah. All right. Now you're making me hungry for pizza, Britt, and I know I have some in the fridge. All right. We have one more question that we wanted to pose to the audience here, and I think it's been brought up here a couple of times around, the social aspect of cities, the fact that cities are, going to be around. It's just, you know, how will they eventually evolve? But I think an interesting question is, you know, through the COVID crisis, how connected do you feel to your neighbors and community? Do you feel more connected, less connected, or about the same? I think we've talked, you know, I mean, everyone's been relatively isolated, but we've talked about 15-minute city. I mean, all of these things, all of these connections. You know, how does that look? All right. Give people just a moment here. And I'd also pose it to each of the panelists here. I mean, Eric, how about you? Have you felt more connected or less connected or about the same?
I think just because of personal circumstances, it's about the same, but I'm certainly seeing, you know, very strong messages coming out of some communities about the level of support that's gone on. I mean, I've seen it in my mother's neighborhood, for example. She's 90, and the way neighbors rallied around the vulnerable in particular was really impressive. So I think, you know, it has shown the best in many communities, as often crises do. I mean, there's a lot of history about this and literature about, you know, how people do respond to disasters and to dramatic impacts. The question is, you know, how much of that you can carry forward and in what ways. But I do also think, given we're talking a lot about technology, I think it's a good corrective to any temptation to see technology as the answer to all problems. You know, what one commentator calls, you know, technology solutionism. You know, the answer to many of these issues are embedded in the communities of our cities, and then technology there is to enable and support what those communities need, and pulling that together, which I think we've seen, particularly in some of the Asian cities, which have been very good at mixing technology and community solutions to deal with the pandemic. I think that's a really good corrective.
Yeah, definitely. Mackie, how about you? Are you feeling more connected or less connected?
So it's a tough one. It's funny. I was looking at this and I'm fascinated by the diversity of opinion here. I would say I feel differently connected, right? There are a lot of things I miss, right? We don't give hugs anymore. We don't actually get to be proximal to people in a physically, and I'm an extrovert, so that's hard. At the same time, there's a strange sort of intimacy involved with seeing everyone's house and their children involved in their lives in ways that you would never ever have any visibility into in a professional setting. I think the thing I'm missing in terms of feeling less connected is that definitely friends and family, even though we've got room and time, I feel less connected to than I would like to, because I find the mediated connection via Zoom or via to be unsatisfying for people that I know well and love. And so I think there's a weird part of it where you feel more connected to people you don't know as well, but less connected to people who you know very well. So
yeah, so different kinds of connection. Britt, how about you?
I think I'm thinking about two things. The first is I definitely feel closer, I mean, back to the 15-minute cities idea, closer to my neighborhood, because I'm home all day, every day, you know, and I see those people more times and in more ways and in more emotional states than I probably did before. And so I think that's, you know, that's driven some of that more connection, also the sense that we are, you know, enduring something together. And, you know, one of the things that makes me think about is that, you know, new things are possible. But I think that's been one of the themes of the pandemic, is that, you know, and both social norms, ways of moving, you know, ways of working, and that, you know, what else that's opened up to us to say, you know, if we'd ever said to us, we will live this way for 6 months, 10 months, 12 months, we would have thought you were crazy. And here we are. And so, you know, what other things may that open up in terms of our, you know, openness to, you know, whether it's technologies or, you know, ways of living or sustainability or equity approaches, like, you know, now that we're seeing that the way we were was not the only way to be, where else will that take us?
Yeah, I think just that possibility of making it through this and seeing that there are, you know, the world can change and it can evolve. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about, we've done the polling here, and I think one other piece to bring in is just this kind of the climate change piece, which I think we've talked about some. It's come up as we've been conversing here. But I mean, what are really the intersections that are happening? How do you see these two challenges really coming together in terms of how people can rethink communities and where things can go? And Mackie, how about you? How are you seeing that really start to come together with your energy perspective?
Yeah, I mean, so in a way, I would say that I think the current situation is a bit of a accelerant to some, especially in Europe. It's already been clear. I think the same thing is going to happen in the United States. At the end of the day, to use an architectural trope, there's a bit of a tabula rasa that occurs when the global economy shuts down and all of the things that have been bubbling up for a long time become revealed. And so I do believe that there will be a significant acceleration in the investment in decarbonization. Because even if I just saw a chart the other day that compared the oil index versus the energy and renewables, it is we've crossed a threshold, which I honestly, in 2003, I thought it would be sooner, to be honest with you. We were a little bit off on our predictive capabilities. I'm maybe an optimist, but I think we've crossed into the threshold of the value is in the future. And if you look also at the difference between Tesla's valuation and the automakers, I believe their valuation is more than all automakers combined at this point, which seems a little bit crazy, to be honest with you, but I think is reflective of the fact that the future is there to be owned by those who are willing to make the correct investments and create the world that we know we need to create. And I don't mean owned in the bad way, but I mean inhabited would probably be a better term for it. And so, I think that from a climate change mediation point of view, we are entering into a space of massive investment over the next 10 years, locally and globally, essentially politics notwithstanding. I think on resiliency, it will be interesting to see whether that same investment flows into the resiliency space directly. My experience as a policymaker is that outside of very creative financing tools, it is much harder to find private investment for resiliency. Unless it's something specific to do with insurance, it's harder to do. It's really the government needs to do it, and it is a hard thing for private industry to begin piling money on top of. And so I do think that's going to be a really interesting policy challenge, and honestly, a finance challenge as well, because I think there is an opportunity for private industry. I just think they haven't yet heard the music.
Yeah. Now, Britt, you've worked a lot with cities and you've worked a lot with corporations. So, from your standpoint, how do you see this intersection going for those different groups specifically? I mean, looking at corporations that Mackie, is just talking about. Kind of how do you see that really evolving? With this climate change and COVID intersection.
Absolutely, it's a great question, and I think actually there's a gap between the two right now, and maybe there's a small overlap of resilience. I think when we talk about climate change mitigation, we talk about clean energy. Mackie's points are exactly right. Clean energy is happening. EVs are happening. That stuff is off to the races, and I think corporates are seizing on that. Governments are trying where they can get their money, but that's really off and going. When it comes to impacts, we're seeing a lot of impacts that are the city's problem, but we're trying to find the role for the private sector, I would say. When we think about extreme heat waves and fires overlapping with pandemics, that's creating stress for cities and residents. When we think about marginal individuals who have been disproportionately affected by COVID, who are disproportionately affected by heat, by storms, those are again challenges that cities are feeling extremely strongly, but the role for the corporation remains elusive. I think that free market folks like to wave their hand and say, oh, it'll be a public-private partnership that will take care of, all of these ills. But that, actually making that market run is challenging. It can be done, and actually we're doing some pretty neat stuff around, financing and banks and resilience and climate change, and really being at the front of a lot of these standardizations. But that really for those cities, they're looking for they're looking for the federal government as well to help to set standards, to bring funding, to help to resolve some of these challenges that may be not resolvable by the market. But I think everybody is being faced by these weather events and these disruptions, global supply chains, power outages. I mean, those are affecting companies and cities alike. And so they're starting to plan ahead around each of those. But, a very complex and interesting space.
Yeah, I mean, even though you're talking about cities, like you said, I mean, the corporations are involved in all of this, the federal government, the state government, all of that, really comes into play here, which is what makes it so complex. And Eric, how about you? I mean, even from the technology standpoint, this intersection of COVID and climate change. I mean, what are you seeing there in terms of cities? And we've talked about some of the technology, but I mean, can you give some more specific examples of how things might be changing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's worth remembering, going back to our point before about the longevity of cities, but cities were also really already on the brink of one of the biggest changes historically as they moved to being decarbonized environments, because the modern city was essentially shaped physically by fossil fuel industry in one way or another, by the car in particular, but also by electrification. So that created our 20th century city. As cities look to move away from that model, it really has presented a whole set of questions about how a city operates that we're only starting to address, but have to address very quickly if we're going to hit some of those targets by 2030. Now, going back to Britt's point before, COVID has accelerated the questions about how a city operates efficiently and effectively. And that leaves, I think, a real opportunity, which is the point I was making about being excited about technology, for a real opportunity to apply technology to these really critical issues with a laser focus. So a lot of the peripheral ideas, I think, and sort of perhaps around deployment of advanced technologies in cities will fade away. But we really did come down to these critical issues about decarbonization, safety, efficiency is going to be critical, because obviously we're going to have to save a lot of money on reducing inefficiencies to be able to address the investment in the right areas. So I think data is already front and center now because of the need to respond to COVID. That's becoming even more important. The city's capacities to manage big data, to do analytics, is going to be, I think, crucial, and we can see a real appetite for that. The deployment of a whole range of IoT technologies, Britt and Mackie have both mentioned that. I think we're going to see that accelerated in critical areas. And then just these decarbonization technologies, whether it's smart street lighting, electric vehicle infrastructure, community energy systems, I think are going to be really interesting. Building up from the community level. It's very hard to design an energy system for a whole city, even a moderately sized one. So I think we're going to see more and more focus on the building blocks around smart districts and smart communities that can bring together the multiple pieces around electric vehicles, renewable energy, smart metering, smart grids, storage, etc. That's going to be one of the fascinating areas.
I was going to add, is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you just spurred something, Eric, you spurred something in my mind that I've been thinking about. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about one of the real dangers that exists in terms of these times of change is that those who have historically not had access, that it gets exacerbated. And so as we are going through this transformation with a lens on equity, one of the things to consider is that equity and access to these commodities and to these services is one of the most important things we have to change about how we plan cities and how we execute. There is already an entity that was designed to deliver equity and access and ubiquity for all citizens, which is actually a really radical idea in the 20s, the utility. They made utilities to deliver critical commodity to every single person in society at an affordable rate with extremely high reliability, which if you were to try to design that system now, you would be laughed out of the room from a politics point of view. It'd be impossible, but it's a really, really useful tool. And I think one of the really important things as we're thinking about and as we are acting, and I have a lot of utility clients, but understanding that that engine exists, and don't think of the utility as an electric utility. It's essentially, they sell ubiquity. And so the question is, what do you need everyone to have access to? You could make an argument that taxis are a mobility utility, that public transit is similarly a mobility utility. These things where we need to ensure that everyone has access. The nature technologically is to atomize, right? That's good from a distributed network point of view, but it presents a significant risk of increasing inequality if you're not careful. And I think we have some policy tools developed in and around the utility space that can help with that, but we can't forget about them and think about them only as the people on the trucks that I'm mad at when the lights go out when there's a storm.
And I think something there, Mackie, and it ties into an audience question that we got of how can the established grid layout of cities be foundational to the design of the future electricity grid? I mean, there's that ubiquity, and also at the same time, delivering cleaner energy, better resources for people. I mean, how do you really find that balance? With
yeah,
that
I mean, I would actually turn that question around and say, how can the design of the electricity grid or any other sort of grid affect how we are able to lay out cities as they're growing and shaping going forward? Just because I think it's a little bit hard to do it the other way around, streets and, but if you think about it in that way, it sort of goes back to this question of what is the role of the utility? Is it to connect these pods of community energy, sort of self-supporting community energy areas? Is it to connect everyone to bandwidth? The utility, they could easily become the bandwidth provider of the future to ensure everyone has access, or at least the infrastructure provider. To me, it's a little bit less about, and this is the architect in me is cringing, it's less about the formal look of the grid or the formal construction of the grid and more about its function. Right, so it's actually not so much about the diagram, to use an architecture term, and it's much more about what does it do, and who does it do it for. And I think those are the questions where, to some extent, we've gotten so used to utilities that we've forgotten how useful they are, because they, in a weird way, they won. Right, we asked these entities to create access and equity to every single person in society. They did it, and now we're used to it and just expect it all the time, not thinking about how monstrous of a task that is. But now that we've got the tool to do it, I think it's a really important time to rethink how we use that tool. And it can be a really powerful way to guarantee that equity going forward.
Definitely. And Britt, how about you? I mean, with the ubiquity and access, I mean, what are you seeing from the city standpoint of what cities can do to really help support that as well?
So I was thinking, I mean, if Mackie's point is that the utility is also designed to support equity, access, and overall well-being, the government is as well. I mean, that's the other sort of classic entity, whether it's the city government, the state government, the federal government, to provide those services and opportunities. In terms of what we're seeing from cities, again, I think I said it before, I mean, cities are surviving. They are, I think, I remember I did a webinar, I guess, 2 months ago, and we all sort of said, well, we're in survival mode now, but we'll be, finding our new future soon, and we're still surviving. And so I think so we're still seeing lightweight solutions, because the bulk of the resources are still being dedicated to public health and to a lesser extent, education and safety. And so we're seeing innovations, particularly around mobility, which has been very interesting. I mean, as people move differently, expansions of the curb and the street and bike lanes, and continuing to think about how we can move people around, particularly in rural areas. We're seeing perhaps a a decline in the transit network company as the long-term solution for public mobility. We're seeing more, to Eric's point with 15-minute city services in neighborhoods because people aren't moving around as much, whether it's COVID testing or food. And so, we're seeing experimentation with all of these ideas, and we're seeing hotspots and laptops for kids as a way to start to address some of Mackie's points about digital equity and access. And all of these are happening, but I think, but they're happening in sort of small and flexible ways. We're testing the ideas as we solve the problems in a crisis mode. And it'll be interesting to see where we go from there. We've seen in Los Angeles, in Boston, and even in every small city that is just keeping the lights on. All of them are doing really impressive and outstanding things.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, in being the small and being flexible. But then the question is to me, well, when does it become more widespread? Because cities are they're large, and I think an audience member had brought up a great point that the population is expanding, people are coming into cities. So how do you really start to build out that technology and infrastructure to be able to support that? And I'd be interested on your perspective, Eric, around that, in terms of what cities are really doing to kind of take some of these smaller solutions and really build them into something larger.
Yeah, and it's a good point, because one of the challenges with much of the technology adoption we've seen in cities is there's been a challenge to scale it beyond smaller projects. I mean, we've started to see a breakthrough on some pieces. One of them, I would say, is actually smart grid and smart meter infrastructure, which, again, once we solve something, it no longer becomes technically exciting. It's not a sexy item anymore. We're saying, well, yeah, it's a smart meter, but that's a big program to instrument our cities, right? We're seeing that now with street lighting, for example. It's now largely accepted that not only should you have LEDs, but you should connect those LEDs at the same time. So that's another technology that's passing over the bridge, if you like, in terms of scalability. But I think in terms of that broader set of questions around connectivity and how we bring communities in, that takes a lot more strategic thinking and a commitment to build a strategy around those goals. So I think cities need to be thinking about when they're making a big investment, and if we start to see infrastructure funding coming through to help with the recovery, then cities need to bring that lens, as Mackie called it, of social equity and that lens of sustainability to those programs, because it's one of the biggest capabilities the city has when it has a big capital project to deliver on. That's when it can leverage a whole range of skills and a whole range of capabilities to make things shift. And I think that's going to be a really important test. Do we see cities embedding sustainability goals and social justice goals in the projects that come out of this crisis, and then leveraging technology to meet those goals in a flexible way? And actually, that's a third strand. Are they thinking digitally as they do those projects as well? So you want a digital, sustainable, and socially just infrastructure to come out of this.
Yeah, and I feel like we're in an inflection point around these technologies and smart cities, where we've realized that they can help us be everywhere, be remote, provide more services. But in our first instantiation, we sort of thought they were going to be complete walled garden ecosystems sold by an individual provider. And now, as we've broadened our lens both to privacy, to equity, we realize that maybe that's not how we want technology and infrastructure to be in our cities. But we're not quite sure what we do want yet. And so we're still, I think that next moment is there. We still believe in the power of technology and data to support these growing cities, and the need for expansive, how do you serve a lot of people with a static amount of resources? Technology, that's what Facebook is. It only takes 5 people, they add 1 million, it's easy, it all runs off the platform in the cloud. And so that's the goal, is how can we deliver services using that same incremental unit cheap power from technology. But I think we're still looking for how to do it in, as Eric said, in a way that aligns with our social goals.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think we also had someone ask a question that I feel like is foundational. I mean, Eric, you talked a little bit about trying to incorporate in these initiatives that are going on, equity and social justice and all of these different very important things. And one audience member had the question of, for the thousands of cities that are doing, very little to practically nothing to address global climate change, what if anything can be done to prompt them to act? I mean, what can really help move that forward for different communities with different values?
Yeah, well, actually, I think that's a bit negative. I think a lot of cities have taken on this, and dare I say, are ahead of a lot of central governments in some ways. But yeah, there's obviously an uneven spread around that. I mean, basically, there are other two forms of pressure, I think, that come on cities that aren't doing it. One is top down, so you do get central or state government that puts a lever under those cities and moves them on against a national agenda or an international agenda if they're signed up to Paris or from the EU. And the other is bottom up. And obviously we've seen that with the climate strike action, where the communities themselves are taking that on and raising that up. And let's be honest, a lot of reaction that's coming within cities to move forward is because they're starting to feel the pressure from their communities. So, going back to Britt's point about the complexity of cities and what needs to be done, and yeah, I think we often oversimplify when we think about a city, and you really can't, because you can't, the complexity of a city, it is a complex adaptive system. It is highly sensitive to multiple variables that take place. And so when you're talking about making a big change, you're looking at the different factors coming together. So you do need city advocacy from leadership. You need bottom-up support, which either can be a driver or it needs to be gained secondly. And you need the support from central government because there's big infrastructure projects, there's big investment decisions that have to be made by central government.
And I think this brings up the question of, I mean, what cities, what utilities or organizations do you all feel are really leading the way, and being a good example of how we can be responding to all these different changes that are going on? I'd love to hear what cities or communities you feel like are doing a really good job at this, and maybe what are some of the lessons learned from those communities. And I'm gonna pick on you first, Britt, and see what you have to say about that.
Sure, absolutely. So I think the first thing to consider is that there's a global perspective on this, and it has a lot to do with the federal frameworks in which you operate. That what is possible in Taiwan or in France, may not be possible in Texas right now, and that we have to look at the innovations that are happening within those frameworks. Like I think obviously some of the things that Paris has done around mobility are incredible, and the push to electrification in Germany are all very, very impressive, and I think show the way of what's possible. But obviously they have standardization and regulatory frameworks to support that. Within the U.S., I think we're seeing again really interesting stuff coming out of Los Angeles. They've been very interested in mobility equity, and especially heavy-duty goods movement, the ports, the highways, the trucks, and the environmental justice impacts of that. And they've been transitioning both from a regulation, from an infrastructure, from a technology perspective, trying to figure out how are we going to clean, how can we clean the heavy-duty goods movement system and take it EV so that we get that win-win of we have clean air and we protect our vulnerable people. And they're tackling it from a 360-degree view, which I think is really impressive. And again, I think I mentioned Boston and some of their innovations. I think the other thing I wanted to highlight was those, small cities across the country. Like it's easy to talk about the big guys because they do have more resources, but that, what you're seeing in small communities is their abilities to deliver these solutions with less, whether it's pulling your community together, or figuring out how you can keep those services coming when when you're still waiting for even state and COVID dollars to come.
Yeah, definitely. And Mackie, how about you? What are you seeing in terms of leading communities?
Yeah, I mean, so from a community's point of view, I think there are flashes of brilliance almost everywhere, right? I think you can find, and I find this is true of utilities, you can always find the person who gets it and just try to make them win. and it's part of our role as consultants to do that. And so those flashes of brilliance are everywhere. There's always someone who's pushing the ball forward. I think there are a lot of communities that have some gifts that others don't have, and it has allowed them to move forward faster. Austin, Texas comes to mind. I think where there's a sort of nice convergence of talent, money, value, location, culture, all these things which are drawing investment of both emotion and money that allow the policymakers to make leaps and bounds that is harder to do elsewhere. One thing I will say though is I do believe, Britt, to your point, I think the common denominator for success across the society is essentially a revivification of federal investment in, frankly, the society at all in the United States, but particularly in cities. I think that will and must happen. I think in Europe, you're seeing as part of their response plan, and Eric, you should weigh in here, that there's big opportunity for those who are interested in these climate-facing, smart city-facing technologies, because they've essentially committed to something that looks like a version of a Green New Deal as their recovery plan in the EU. And I think you're going to see more of that. You're going to see that, frankly, all over the world, because, as we talked about earlier, the value is there from an investment point of view. But I do think that is a really important part. If you know, this is just the old urban planner architect. Big cities need about, so I used to say this for New York, you need about $500 billion every 50 years, all in one big bunch of infrastructure investment in order to maintain its relevancy and to evolve its infrastructure. That is really, really hard to do with any money other than federal money for cities. And so the countries that are able to figure that out are really going to be able to put their cities in a better position in the future. I think that is, that's going to be the axis of success.
Yeah, I definitely liked what you brought up around, the people piece of being able to kind of spark that inspiration and, get others around that. But then there is this bigger piece that can come in and really help, provide the infrastructure and resources to be able to make it happen. And Eric, how about you? I mean, what are you thinking around this, given what
So,
Britt and Mackie have talked about?
yeah, I mean, I think picking up on what the guys said, and particularly Mackie, that point about flashes of brilliance. So there's lots of cities I could mention doing some really cool stuff. Just take one. Philadelphia, which just has come up with a plan around digital equity, which I think is great going forward. Lots of cities rethinking how they're using space, trying not to get, to increase cycling and pedestrianism, rethinking routes, lots and lots of things, like lots of good uses of data. But going back to that point about the big picture, I think, which is really important, I wrote a blog around how smart cities have to become mission oriented, I think, if they're going to be viable. And what that means is I think they need a vision that brings this together ready to deal with the uncertainties we've talked about through this. So I think I'll just pick out a few that I think are really leading in that. We talked about Paris, or it's got quite a few mentions. That's great, around the 15-minute city. I'd point to Amsterdam, thinking around the donut city, which is based on the economist Kate Raworth's work around sustainability and circular economy. So bringing this integrated strategy in, again, accelerating something it was already thinking about before COVID, but this brings that new dimension. Milan, one of the first cities in Western Europe and to be hit massively by COVID, but also one of the first to come out with a strategic plan for recovery based around sustainability goals and what it wants to think about the city. And Helsinki, which has made a strong commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals coming out of the UN, which is a really integrated view about how you build a sustainable, equitable city for all. So I think there's some cities now coming together with really strong visions for how they're going to bring these different elements that we've been talking together into some sort of cohesive approach going forward.
Yeah, I like that a lot of just, yeah, I mean, that vision and, having, what's been going on kind of being that spark to, make a move or to do something differently and really think about it differently. I guess just with the few minutes we have left here, we've had some great questions come in. If anyone else has questions, we'd love to answer them. But also, I want to just get a sense of, the fact that cities and governments are facing, obviously massive losses in revenue, and there are great visions out there and great work being done. But what can be done to really help cities overcome that? I mean, Mackie, I would think, like you mentioned, in terms of federal government and investment there. I mean, what do you see really needing to happen in the near term to make some of these things start to come to fruition?
Well, I mean, I do think there will be. I'm actually confident there will be a large federal investment in infrastructure. What that looks like, we don't really know, but I think we're in an economic situation not dissimilar from the Great Depression. I expect to see solutions not dissimilar from the Works Progress Administration or agency. I've forgotten whether it's administration or agency. Anyway, but
now it's going to bother me.
Yeah.
Administration.
It's administration. All right. Thanks, Britt.
But so I do expect that. I also think that there are some other tools. I mean, I having been in state policy, I know that there are significant portions of the country at the state level that are looking at carbon price, right? New revenue, right? And a price on carbon. It would be, depending, there's always a question of sources of funds and uses of funds, but as a potential opportunity that I do believe, I mean, looking at the way policy is evolving in the Northeast and on the West Coast in particular, I would not be surprised to see a regional carbon price within the next 5 years, certainly over here in the Northeast. We have no idea how policy is going to evolve, but I think the states have been talking about this now for 6-7 years at this point. It has started to reach a point of clarity around how it will work, and so I do think that will also be an important policy tool.
Yeah, new ways to revenue, new paths to revenue. Britt, how about you? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of what communities can be doing?
Yeah, I think this question of, we want a transformation, but how do we pay for it is the deepest and toughest question. And I mean, I think there is, and hoping for large amounts of federal money is obviously, one pathway. I think there's a lot of opportunity where we can set the policy framework and the program framework to spur innovation and creativity. I mean, carbon price being obviously, one particular version of that. We're seeing congestion pricing as another way. We're seeing, again, state and federal regulatory policy frameworks as a way, in terms of the way broadband is regulated and platforms and raising money from access to land. I think all of those things are opportunities to push and create and innovate. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that too. As we hope for the dollars, we're going to need to be making these transitions as we go. And so, and I don't, again, a bit like the smart city technology vision, it will be challenging, and that, we're seeing small ideas and innovations, but that I think we're going to need to be doing that. And there's an important role for the private sector, both in meeting those policy frameworks, for companies and, and innovators that can deliver those solutions now that align with our current understanding of what we need to build back, the way we need to be equitable, and, the sustainable future we need. That those companies stand to profit tremendously. And so that's another source of innovation that we'll be obviously, looking to and looking for.
Yeah, using those organizations and companies to help drive that as well. Absolutely. And Eric, how about you? We have a couple of minutes left here. I think you're going to get the last word. So, how do we go about addressing this, given these massive revenue shortfalls that we've seen?
If we look at it through the lens of the last 10 years or perhaps more for city finance, then it's going to be really tough. And meeting some of those aspirations we talked about are going to be difficult. But I think the other thing to take away from this is we've seen in the last 6 months what governments can do when they bring all their resources to address a challenge, as was done with the New Deal, as was done in the wartime economy in the Second World War. Britain built the NHS while it was bankrupt after the Second World War, perhaps one of the greatest achievements of government, certainly in this country for 100 years. if we bring the same will and imagination that they've brought to the crisis and all the resources available to a large modern state, I think we can do these things. So we need a will and we need a vision, and then obviously then delivering around those priorities.
Yeah, I like that as a wrap up. It's not, just about that money, but that motivation and the will and people really coming together and being committed to making this happen. Well, great. Well, we are unfortunately out of time. Definitely enjoyed this conversation with all of you. Just want to give a shout out to Eric, Mackie, and Britt for taking the time to share their insights with us today, and appreciate all the audience questions and participation. It was really cool to see what you all are thinking, and we definitely encourage you to check out future webinars that we have around various topics of resilience. And thank you so much, and we hope everyone has a great day. Thanks. Bye.